So this is the first half of Chapter 9, which is on avoidance behavior. Chapter 9 is all about aversive stimuli. Now, aversive things are things that we don't like and we want to avoid. Now, aversive stimuli can do two things to our behavior. It can increase a behavior, and if an aversive stimulus is used to increase our behavior, well, an increase is automatically reinforcement. So we're talking about negative reinforcement because something aversive is going to be removed if we do a particular behavior. Aversive stimuli can also be used to decrease behavior, and decrease behavior comes from punishment. So in this case, we're going to be talking about positive punishment because an aversive stimulus would be applied to us if we did something in particular. So it can either increase or decrease depending on how it's being used, applied or taken away. Now we're just going to be talking about negative reinforcement, and when negative reinforcement's used, there are two possibilities. It may be that the aversive stimulus is already being applied. So let's say you forget to put on your seatbelt and your car is making this buzzing noise. Well, then your behavior of putting on the seatbelt stops that noise. And if it was already going and you stopped it, we call it an escape response. However, you probably learn pretty quickly that if you put your seatbelt on, within the first 20 seconds of driving, you can avoid the buzzer altogether. And in that case, you have an avoidance response because it avoids the buzzer even beginning. And typically, when we're learning things, we start out with escape responses, and then we move to avoidance responses. Now, just other examples of escape. Let's say your mom is nagging you or your roommate's nagging you, clean the dishes, you slob. And you clean the dishes and they stop nagging you. Which one is that? That would be an escape response because the nagging is already happening. But on the other hand, if you're sitting in your apartment and you realize, oh, my roommate's going to be home soon and they're just going to get on my case if they see these dishes, so I'll just do them now. Well, that's an avoidance response. You've prevented the nagging altogether by doing the behavior ahead of time. Now, one thing I did want to point out on the first slide here is a lot of times people think of aversive as meaning pain. Well, pain is aversive, but there are lots of other things that fall into this category. Anything that's annoying, embarrassing, just gives you a negative feeling, that would be considered aversive. So it doesn't have to be pain. We could use punishment for a cat by spraying water on them, and that doesn't hurt them, but it would be aversive. All right. Okay, so how do we study avoidance in a Skinner box? Basically, you take a rat and you can give him a foot shock, which we know would make him jump. But we give him a little warning light. And he learns when this light comes on that he'll get shocked soon. But he's in a cage with two parts, and all he has to do is jump over this little barrier, and he can escape the shock or avoid the shock. There's a little picture of it in your textbook. Now, you see here I have this set up as classical conditioning, which it is. I associate this light with shock, and I have a response. My response is to jump and get out of the way. So the question, first of all, now is, well, where's the operant conditioning? Because that's what we're talking about now. Well, it comes in here. I want you to understand the two-part theory of avoidance. Now, the two-part theory has two parts. So the first part actually is classical conditioning. And what happens is we become classically conditioned to fear a particular stimulus, usually a CS, a warning of things to come. It might be, I'm afraid of going outside, leaving my home because of having a panic attack. So the thought of leaving my home is a CS for the US of having a panic attack. And I actually fear the idea of leaving my home. Now, once I have some kind of fear conditioned in me, or I've got attacked by a dog when I was a kid, okay, so I have this fear of dogs. And the dog is a CS for the US of attack. The second part of the theory says, well, if there's some behavior I can do that reduces my fear, takes my fear away, well, then I'll do that because of the negative reinforcement of losing my fear. So say I was attacked by a dog, I'm nervous around dogs. All I have to do is avoid dogs. Don't go near them. If I see one, walk the other direction, go inside the house, say, keep that thing away from me. And by doing that, I reduce my fear and anxiety, and therefore I'm negatively reinforced. So the operant conditioning comes in the second half of the two-part theory. Now, this two-part theory works really well, and It works well. We're gonna apply it to obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a type of anxiety disorder. You know, there's a fear and anxiety, and then there's a behavior that reduces it. So the fear is the thoughts we have, the obsessions. It might be, an obsession with germs and contamination. And then my behavior is I wash my hands 200 times a day. I have a ritual I do before going to bed about washing in a certain way, putting clean sheets on my bed. I mean, this is a level of OCD that we would consider diagnosable, treatable, as impairing somebody's life. So we have the fear, we have the anxiety from the recurring obsession, and we have the behavior that reduces that anxiety. Another common one is people who are checkers. So they are trying to leave for work, but they keep thinking, did I leave the stove on? Did I leave the curling iron plugged in? Did I do something that's going to burn down the house? And to get rid of that intrusive thought, they have to go back inside and check. Did I lock the door? Did I do all these things? But they get to the point where they have to check so often, they're constantly 45 minutes late for work because they just can't get over this anxiety that something's wrong in the house that's going to be bad while they're gone. Okay, so that fits very nicely on our two-part theory. Now, if we want to look at this, there are a few questions that come up, first of all. The first question we have is, if you are phobic or have OCD, if you're avoiding something, let's say you're phobic of dogs, and you avoid them all the time, and you're not getting attacked, then why don't you extinguish that fear? I mean, typically, if we're exposed to a CS over and over and over, dog, 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 without any US backing it up, no attack, then our conditioned response typically would go away. So why doesn't that happen in phobias? Well, the quick answer is because typically people are so good at limiting their exposure to the CS, I stay away from dogs, that it doesn't have the opportunity to extinguish. So I have these brief little exposures, and so my fear remains. Okay, as far as the two-part theory, there are a few problems that your book mentions that we'll go over real quickly. The first one is when you're trying to apply this to phobia, one thing that's different is in rats in an avoidance study, what they're doing when they're jumping over the barrier, they're avoiding the shock. They avoid the US. But phobics take a lot of pains to avoid the CS. They're not just avoiding being attacked, they're avoiding the dog. So that's a little bit different in these two things. Now, another problem is when you look at rats in a Skinner box, they don't look particularly scared. Now, it's kind of hard to know if a rat's scared, but they look fairly relaxed, and so the whole theory requires some kind of fear or anxiety. So if the animals don't seem fearful, how could this theory be true? And the simple answer to that is, well, you don't have to be, scared out of your wits, but you do have to have some measure of anxiety or fear. There does have to be something there to be reduced by the operant conditioning. So it has to be maintained. Now, there are ways to measure fear in rats or anxiety. You can give them anti-anxiety drugs and see if their behavior changes. You can do what's called an open field test, which is this big box. And rats typically like to be in dark, confined places because it's risky as a prey animal to be out in the open. So in an open field test, they don't tend to wander in the middle of this box. It's like 1 meter by 1 meter square. And they spend all their time around the edges. Well, you give them some Xanax, and all of a sudden they're just kind of wandering around like, oh, this is great, and they don't seem fearful at all. So that's one way to measure it. There are other ways to actually measure fear. But as far as the theory is concerned, it just says, well, you just have to have a little bit of fear maintained, and maybe you don't see that, but it's there. Another criticism is the idea that when you look at phobics, they will make their avoidance response really early in the sort of process that might lead them toward the US. So if somebody's afraid of flying, months in advance, they're going to be making other plans about how to get somewhere, how to, if they have to go on a work trip, how are they going to get there? I always think of John Madden, who would drive in his RV to all these NFL football games across the country because he would not fly. And so it takes a lot of work, and, in the avoidance studies, the rats are jumping just, seconds before they might have gotten shocked. So how does that map on? And there's a really cool study in your text that I want you to go look at. It's the conveyor belt study. And you imagine these little rats on conveyor belts kind of being moved like they're at a grocery store conveyor belt toward this box where they're going to get shocked. And their avoidance response is to kind of run away from it. And what they end up doing is they start making that response very early in the distance that they would have. They don't wait till they get all the way down there. They actually start kind of running back and forth very early. So that is a study that's supposed to kind of address this criticism, and it's just kind of hilarious, so you should really go read it. Okay, now if we want to look at how to treat OCD, the major thing to do is to do what's called ERP, which is exposure and response prevention. Now, this is very similar to the treatments for anxiety disorders, phobias, and end of chapter 5. You need to expose the person to what they're afraid of. In this case, it's the CS. But don't let them make the avoidance response. Now, this wouldn't be like flooding, where you're just like, oh, here's a clown, freak out. But say somebody has a contamination issue with OCD and they clean their hands all the time. So the treatment might be like taking that person, taking their hands and say, okay, hold the mail that came in. Now, that's something that would normally make them very anxious. Report how anxious you are. And they'll, on a scale of 1 to 100, and it might be like, oh, I'm a 99, But the therapist is there with them going, you're doing great. Just hold on to that. Hold on to that. Okay. And they're going to just have them do that until their fear finally kind of goes away. Finally. And it'll take many sessions, and they'll build up to things. But it'll be like, put your hands on this counter. Now, it's really important that you use your kitchen counter normally and don't wash your hands. And I know it's uncomfortable. How uncomfortable is it? And the longer they do that and stay there and practice that, their anxiety levels are going to eventually go down. Now, here's your assignment for this video. I want you to actually email your answer to this question to our TA. You can get her email off the syllabus that's on Blackboard. And in exposure, so if we take this person and we are having their hands placed on the counter and on the mail, and we're waiting till their anxiety goes down. Now remember, that's the CS that I'm exposing them to. Okay, it represents germs to them, but it's mail and it's the kitchen counter. This exposure is taking advantage of what process? Okay, there's one word that describes the process of me exposing them to a CS until their CR decreases, hopefully goes away. What's the name of that process? Email your one-word answer to our TA, and I will see you in class.